Well, first of all, one has to understand what a complex system is, and as distinct from a simple system. And a city is a quintessential complex system, and in the sense that it contains huge numbers of components, large population of people, contains lots of buildings, lots of different activities, lots of different time scales, spatial scales, and in addition to that, it's continually evolving and adapting. So it's a classic complex adaptive system, and trying to come to terms with that in terms of not only understanding what its organization and dynamics is, but also trying to make it predictive, I think, is one of the sort of grand challenges of the 21st century, because our future does depend upon the future of cities. And so certainly what I've been trying to do is bring, if you like, some of the ideas, concepts, paradigms of the physical sciences and mathematics to understand how cities function, to understand if there are any underlying principles that transcend the history, geography, and culture, so that we can really help design new cities, because in various parts of the world, especially China and Africa and Latin America, new cities will have to be built, and certainly cities will continue to grow. So, so it's extremely important, I think, that we try to find what has come to be known as the science of cities, but built on this idea that these are complex adaptive systems. Well, I think we're still at a very primitive stage, really. I think one of the things that where we have made tremendous progress is in this area of so-called scaling laws, because what we've learned from that is underlying the extraordinary complexity and diversity of cities, the kind of messiness of cities, and the fact that if here we just look out the window and you just see lots of buildings, and if we look down below, we see roads and we see people and things. It looks like just some arbitrary mess. And yet, one of the things that when one looks at these scaling laws, one discovers that underlying that great complexity and messiness, actually there is an approximate simplicity that seems to be at work. And the scaling laws simply are telling you how, as a city grows, or as one city in relationship to another, how its various metrics and characteristics change with size. And one would have thought there wouldn't have been any really systematic relationship, but in fact it's an extraordinary systematic relationship that seems to be valid across the globe. So in that sense, great progress has been made, and to some extent understanding the origin of these scaling laws in terms that they are derivable from the underlying networks that operate in cities, whether they're infrastructural networks like roads and electrical lines, or whether they're social networks like the interaction between people and groups of people. That I think many of us believe is what is driving these laws. But in actually getting the mathematics and the underlying real principles of how a city operates, we're still very much at a primitive stage. Well, I think that's it's a very exciting prospect, the fact that we have now the ability to generate enormous amounts of data about almost every aspect of the way cities function and the way people within cities function, and this is crucial. And in fact, one of the ironies of that situation is that in order to really develop a science, of course you need lots of data, but you also need historical data. You need to see the time evolution of cities, and I think that's been somewhat frustrating, is that we have quite a lot of data about present-day cities or cities in the recent past, but one would also like to have data on cities in 1920, for example, or in 1820 or 1520, and sadly we don't have access to that. That data almost certainly exists, by the way, I would say in various forms, but finding where it is and coordinating it and putting it into digital form that can be used is a mammoth task, which certainly should be done. But since we don't have that, we have to rely on obviously developing ideas and theories, but also using what we can from generating these big data sets, either from sort of detectors that we put around cities for various things, or things like monitoring, if we can, or getting hold of the data from mobile phone interactions and so forth, and social media. All these kinds of things actually are potentially important sources for the data that can help us understand how cities function. Yeah, so one of the things that comes out of the scaling laws is that cities scale non-linearly. That is, if you double the size of a city, you don't get twice as much of everything that's that was in the original city. You don't get twice as long roads. You don't get twice as many cases of influenza. You don't get twice as much crime. You don't get twice as many patents produced. What you discover is that it is non-linear in the sense that typically if you double the size of a city within a given urban system, you get 85% more of the infrastructural components of a city. So you don't need twice as many petrol stations, you only need 85% more. There's a marvelous economy of scale. And at the same time, socioeconomic activity, represented by many of the things we find attractive about cities, the number of fancy restaurants, the number of educational institutions, the number of patents produced, and so on, and also the negative side of social interactions, the amount of crime, the amount of disease, and so on. These all, you get an extra 15%. You get twice as many plus 15%. So that's nonlinear, and it is derived, we believe, from the nonlinearity of social interactions, that the positive feedback mechanisms that occur by bringing people together. A talks to B, B talks to C, C talks to D, and D talks back to A, and there's a kind of interaction between them, and ideas are created, and innovation comes because of that, and that's a primitive version of it, but that's really what a city does. And in fact, one can think of a city as a machine for facilitating that kind of interaction, so that cities, this marvelous invention that we have serendipitously created, is a machine for encouraging and facilitating social interaction to create more wealth, to create more ideas, to innovate, and so forth. But in a highly nonlinear way. Nonlinearity is integral to the whole process. Yeah, that's a very difficult question to answer. The question as to what defines a neighborhood. And, we have a intuitive sense of it. People talk about neighborhoods, everything from, a downtown as a neighborhood to, a certain area in which you live, and you feel to a greater or lesser degree that you're part of that neighborhood, part of that community. And you even may think of it as having certain characteristics. It may be to do with economic activity. It may be to do with social status, and so forth. But I think it's been one of the big challenges, actually, of urban planning is to really define a neighborhood and define it in a operational way. That is, obviously there aren't, we often draw boundaries, and we often think of a neighborhood as having a boundary, but of course that boundary is very gray. And not only is it very gray, one of the things that is often not sufficiently appreciated is dynamic. It's not a fixed place. It changes, and its characteristics change. And trying to understand that and to monitor it, even to measure it, I think is a big challenge, but it's an extremely important one to come to terms with. I think in order to facilitate, the quality and standard of living of the citizens of a community, one need, and especially because there is I suppose almost an innate, I don't like to use the word, but tribalism almost, that we all have a certain sense of identity, not just with the city we live in or town we live in, but often it is with the neighborhood. So to try to capture that, I think, is extremely important, since it seems to be part of who we are as human beings. And certainly in terms of allocating resources and deciding, what changes to make and how to respond to new technologies, I think, cities do it often by neighborhoods. They often deconstruct the city into neighborhoods, but they're often arbitrary, and they often are based on history, and some, go back over 100 years. So I think we need to rethink that. And I think, going to your previous question, I think the access to big data, to being able to monitor in much closer form than we ever were able to do, I think gives us potentially the tools to define a neighborhood and understand a neighborhood in ways that we were unable to do so before, where we had these kind of fixed entities that were sort of arbitrarily drawn. In the same way, often the city itself is that way. One has defined a city with a given, and there we do have precise boundaries, we call which are political boundaries, administrative boundaries, and they're arbitrary, but they've become fixed. And I think, I'm not sure they're useful, or at least they may be hindrances to, thinking of a city in terms of really what it is as a metropolitan area, and thinking of it as a network system. And that network system does not respect some arbitrary drawn line on a map. And so I think it's time to come to terms with this and try to go beyond it, because we are starting, in some form or another, to develop the tools to take real advantage and help mitigate many of the problems we're going to have to face. Well, that's a huge challenge again. That's another major challenge for the 21st century. I think, in the past, we did deconstruct the spectrum of questions and problems into specific domains. We treat the finances of a city, the health, the education, the infrastructure, and so forth, all of these things separately. And even when we do our research, we do that. I mean, universities are divided into departments, and departments are subdivided into sub-departments. And, so we have, and each of these often are kind of essentially autonomous and hardly speak to one another, even though they're all trying to attack problems that are interrelated. And I think we've developed a society at an extraordinarily rapid rate that has become extremely complex, so that this issue of dividing everything up and reducing it may not have been a problem previously. And indeed, quite the contrary, has given us tremendous insights, I would say, into understanding many of the issues we have to face. But it may no longer be sufficient and even appropriate to think this way. I think I think the evidence is mounting very strongly that we need to think in a much more holistic, integrated way, and to see these things as part of a whole, and recognize that each one is of itself, which was of itself a complex adaptive system, is actually just one part of an integrated whole complex adaptive system. So we have kind of a system of systems, each part of which is adapting and evolving itself. So this is a huge challenge. And in order to address some of these big issues, especially that of sustainability, whether it's on the local scale or is on the global scale, we need to start to develop something that's much more unified, much more integrated. And I did, as you say, somewhat whimsically call this the grand unified theory of sustainability, and bringing together all the stakeholders, whether they're across the many academic kinds of departments or academic studies, but bring those together with all the multiple practitioners that are involved, everything from the administrators of a city, for example, to those that are planning, trying to do urban planning, the architects, the politicians, the policymakers. But we need to bring all of these together and to have not just a dialogue, but to actually work together at all levels, from the people making the decisions all the way through to those in the trenches sort of doing the day-to-day detailed work. So we need to ultimately, though, to develop a big picture framework, a kind of matrix in which we can see all these problems and see how they're interrelated. Because otherwise, I think we're doomed to be dealing with more and more complex unintended consequences. And some of those unintended consequences will lead to a situation that is no longer sustainable, no longer tenable. Well, I think the great thing about cities, and they're to be distinguished from companies, even though they're both social organizations, the great thing about cities is that they are, not only are they multidimensional, whereas companies tend to be not exactly unidimensional, but very small dimensionality. Cities are multidimensional, but also their dimensionality continues to grow as the city grows. More and more different things evolve. And the lessons from the past, I think, are that a thriving city and cities that are truly successful encourage greater and greater diversity, and diversity of employment, diversity of jobs, but creating an environment, both a physical and social environment, to encourage new ideas, to encourage innovation by bringing together people in the right kinds of environments. So creating an environment where there's lots of interactions, because ideas come from people interacting. So I think this is crucial, and it has in the past guaranteed that cities continue to reinvent themselves. So we go through this continuous process of reinvention, and that reinvention has led to open-ended growth. It does bring up the problem, which is something that concerns me greatly, and that is that open-ended growth sustainable? And I have concluded that it isn't, unless we have a different kind of innovation, because usually when we think of innovation, we usually think of it as in physical terms, as in technological terms. I mean, and all the great innovations in the past are usually thought of that way. But some are not, and some are more cultural kinds of innovations. I would say in some ways you could argue that the discovery of capitalism and entrepreneurship was a cultural change. Not that that wasn't happening before, but it became a dominant form of interaction, and which has been a major driver for the success of cities and society and economies in the last 200 years. So there have been innovations that have been non-technological, and I think the time has come for a major non-technological but cultural change in order for us to avoid collapse. And that has to do with the way we think about our relationship to our society, the relationship to each other, and move away from a more individualistic, narcissistic kind of culture where greed in some form or another, or wanting more, let's put it that way, has been a dominant form, to where we need to be much more concerned with our neighbors, and be much more connected, and recognize that we don't need more physical phenomena. We have, there's only so many cars you can own, so to speak. So to get to a stage of not having just material well-being, but having more of a, for want of a better word, kind of spiritual and cultural well-being. And I don't know what that would be, that kind of paradigm shift, but it needs to be a different kind of paradigm shift than one we've had in the past, because we cannot sustain this treadmill of continuous change, increasing the pace of life. And it is the real catch in all this is that by the process of innovation, we have sped up life, and that is simply not sustainable. That we're just not simply able to keep up with that treadmill unless we make some other kind of change. Well, of course, Singapore, it's a platitude, but Singapore is unique, totally unique. It's not only unique on the planet today in being a true city-state, but it's unique historically, because even though we've used that phrase city-state in the past, in fact, there's not been a place like Singapore, because city-states in the past relied on territory outside of the city for their resources, and some of those resources, being agricultural, food, but also for people. Singapore does rely on the outside for people. I mean, there's, it has a large immigrant community, but it has no hinterland in the usual sense of that. It disconnected from Malaysia, which would have been its natural hinterland. And so its hinterland is the globe. So it's in a very special place. And so I think one of the things that Singapore has to understand more deeply than I think it does is what does it mean to be a global hub? Because it relies on trade. So to understand what its relationship is to New York, to London, to Hong Kong, Shanghai, and so forth, and to ask whether that forms, in the 21st century, a kind of global urban system. And so to understand that, and to understand how it should perceive itself and formulate its strategy based on metrics relative to the global situation. Now, no other city in the world has to do quite that. New York is a global hub, but it also is a hub of the United States. It has, the whole of the United States as that is of which it's part, but it's also part of the global network. Singapore only has the global network. So, so I think that's crucial. So it has to look as much externally as it does internally. And, it's done extraordinarily well, obviously. I mean, it's done incredibly well. But of course, this situation makes it potentially very vulnerable. It needs to be even more diversified than it is. And that's very difficult because it does rely on trade. Trade is, what it stands for. And, it is diversified in its trade, and I think that's good. But it also somehow needs to diversify in terms of other things that it does. And I don't know quite what that could be and how it could even do it. But otherwise it remains forever vulnerable. And I'm not saying anything that everybody doesn't recognize in some form or another. But I think the only thing I would emphasize here is what I said a moment ago, but understanding what its role is globally in a deeper way, in a more scientific framework, I think is ultimately quite crucial for its long-term survival.